In today's video, we're going to go over 3 ways to use machines in your shop to do edge jointing of lumber. Now, these are the 3 methods I use. There are more methods, but these are the ones I'm really familiar with and I think work very well, so we're going to cover them. You can either use the table saw, the handheld router, and we're going to cover the router table as well. If you have any of those tools, follow along and we'll be able to get you nice, clean, straight edges on any wood you use. Now, the first method we're going to go over is my personal favorite method of the ones I use. It's the table saw jointing sled. The upsides of this jig are the weight and stability and the ability to use the fence as a reference. It can also double as a tapering jig with a slight modification. And because it uses the fence, in my case, instead of the miter gauge, we can get a lot more width in here. I also like the power and direct kind of rigidity of a table saw blade over something like a router bit, but that's a bit of a different discussion. And just in general, I find it to be the fastest method. There's not a lot of setup time. Now, there are some downsides to this method as well. The immediate one is the limitation of length. I have a relatively large saw. I use this same sled on my DeWalt table saw, job site saw, but it was a little big for that. And for me, this sled is, I think, about 25 inches, and I only go up to 31 inches on the board because of how far I can start back to reference this. So you're not going to be jointing a 6-foot board using this. You also automatically lose the height of whatever the sled is made out of. That may be a problem for you. It may not matter at all. If you're working with mostly 3/4 inch wood, it's not a problem. Most table saw blades go to 3 inches or a little higher, so you've got a lot of room to work with, but consider that you're going to lose, in my case, 3/4 of an inch. The next downside is that you do have to make and store this. It's not a particularly small jig, but I do like the double ability of a large tapering jig and a straight edge jig. So for me, it makes sense to have something this size and store it. But for a lot of people, this may be a little too big, a little too bulky to take up space for such a specific task. And finally, this is an obvious one, but it relies on you setting your blade to 90 degrees. If that is a problem for you, this is not going to be the greatest method because it's going to obviously be off every time. There is one, I wouldn't call it a downside as all of them rely on this, but you need the face of your board to be flat. This is your reference surface. Your board needs to be relatively flat. And if it isn't flat, then the edge is going to be straight and 90 to this sled, but not necessarily to your board. Now, if your board's not flat, you're going to have a heck of a time running it through the table saw to cut the other edge straight, but that's a different problem. So I've got 3 pieces of wood here that I'm just going to demonstrate how to cut. I've got one that's rough on both sides. This is an odd tapered angle. And also rough on both sides. And then this is a log from a tree. Now, the first piece we're going to do here is pretty easy. It fits within the sled, so we don't have to worry about a slightly different setup that we'll go through for the larger piece. But basically, you just know that this edge is up against your blade, so you're just going to sit over by a little bit. If you're cutting rough sawn lumber, sometimes it's not relatively straight up and down, and it's got kind of an angle. Make sure when you're setting this up that if there is a taper, that the lower side is what you're making sure is out. You don't want the higher side out, and then you're not trimming the lower side. You'll just have to move it out and do it again. I have a lot of clamps on here. These aren't all necessary. I have them on partially for the tapering jig and whatnot, and just for the ability to put my piece anywhere on here. I work with mostly pieces 30 inches and under, so that's part of why this is such a great setup for me. I made this, like I said, about 12 inches wide so that I can get 7 and 8 inch thick pieces on here without having to hang them over at all. So when we think we've got it in place, we're just going to feel along the bottom. This one is really, really wonky and rough, so I've got to do a little angling here. We obviously want to lose as little as possible, so take your time when you're setting this up. I find that 3 clamps is usually good enough, but there have been times when I've done relatively narrow, longer strips and I want clamps all the way around. Okay, now that we've got this all set up, we're going to go run it through. And when using this, I would suggest not using anything higher than a 40 tooth blade. Ripping blades are perfectly fine. When you get over that, it gets a little trickier because you're pushing through the weight of this whole thing. So the saw blade is not just cutting through the weight of the wood as it normally is. It's cutting through the weight of all of this. So the higher you go, 50 is pushing it. I wouldn't use a 50, a combo blade. 40 and under is ideal. I am personally using the Freud glue line rip blade. It's a nice blade. It's not necessary. Normal rip blades are perfectly fine. You'll notice that I've added this push stick style handle to the side. I like it. It allows me to keep pressure up against the fence and keep that hand away. And I usually just feed from the back and from the side. If you don't have this here, grabbing one of the clamps or holding it is totally fine. I just find that this makes it really easy to guide it in. And as you can see, we've got a really nice, clean, straight edge on that. Now this face hasn't been jointed at all, but the jig did its job really well. Another really nicely jointed, straight, smooth edge. You can obviously see another downside here is that the sawdust is not going to get pulled down. As with any non-through cut, it's going to come off to the side a bit. So this is a little dusty, but I don't consider that a large enough of a problem not to use this method. Now, setting up oversized pieces is a little different. We're not going to be able to have the fence in the same spot, or else we're going to rip off a ton of this. So what we really need to do for this is get a tape measure, and you're going to line it up closely and then just quickly go under there and just measure out how far you are. And that way we know that the start and the end are the same distance, so that when we line it up with our table saw blade on the front here, we're going to get a relatively less wasteful cut than if we were to just line it up with the blade as the fence is now. Since we've measured from the front and back and we know that they're roughly the same distance out, we can just line this up with the board itself, and as long as we're pretty close, we'll get a straight edge. And again, a nice clean straight edge on there. That's exactly what we're looking for. So that covers the table saw jointing sled. Like I said, this is my favorite jig. If you're like me and you work with pieces 30-ish inches or less, this is a really good setup. If you use something longer than that, this isn't going to work well for you. There's a couple other table saw methods which I don't personally use, and that is the table saw jointing jig method. My favorite method has its limitations. Dust, length, table saw needs to be set up correctly, those kind of things. The next method we're going to cover is edge jointing on the router table. There's some advantages and disadvantages compared to the other methods. Now, one of the advantages is that with proper in-feed and out-feed support and support inward, you could do a relatively long board. Now, I don't have a ton of long boards around here because I usually cut them down to store them. So this is about the longest I have on hand, but we're going to use this one. This is probably just over 3.5 feet. The next advantage is that you're going to get really good dust collection because this will be spinning and putting all the dust back into the dust collection outlet. So you get very good dust collection by doing it on the table compared to the table saw or the freehand router, plunge router. Other advantages include being able to do a variety of router bits, anything with a straight edge spiral bit, pattern bit, straight bits, any of those. As long as they have something straight and it's the height of the wood, you can do it this way on the router table. And if your bits are sharp, you will get a very good finish from this. You can often get a glue-ready finish from this because of how clean the cut is when using the router bit. Now, some of the limitations are the cutting height of your router bit. You're not going to be able to do a really thick piece of wood unless you have a really tall router bit. If you lack in-feed and out-feed support, you're going to be limited by the table size a little bit. You can generally do about 8 inches to a foot longer on either end than your table. It gets a little sketchy at that point, and anything over that, you're going to need help. Featherboard down, featherboard in, that kind of thing to be able to move a larger board. Now, the main disadvantage to doing it on the router table is the setup time and how finicky it can be. As with the jointer, what we're essentially going to be doing is jutting out the outfeed side and matching our cutter such that it is in line with this outfeed side plate. Our infeed side will therefore be back from the outfeed side, and as it is pushed in, it will remove the amount to match equally with this side. Now, router tables that can do jointing generally come with some kind of rod or mechanism to push this out On the Craig table specifically, we just need to untighten this faceplate and take the rods, and you will see 2 holes on top and 2 holes on the bottom, and you put the rods into the corresponding hole on either side. The holes are offset so that you can take a deeper cut or a smaller cut, though I always prefer to take a slightly smaller cut. Now the setup gets a little tricky here, and I have a full video on jointing with this specific router table. But essentially what we have to do is make sure the cutter head is at 90 degrees to the fence plate, and we then will take something like a ruler and try to line up this outfeed side exactly with that cutter. And this will generally take 1 or 2 test passes before you were able to get this lined up correctly. It's very hard to do on the first try. If you use a bit with a bearing on it, it's a little bit easier, but either way, it still usually takes a few tries because even just tightening down the fence can push it a little bit if you're not very careful. Now, I think I've got a pretty good setup there, but we're gonna have to run a test board first to know. And the way we'll be able to know is that if when we run it through, it keeps hitting into this outfeed side, this bit is not out far enough, meaning we need to go back. We're not removing enough and we're running into this. And if we are too far forward, what will happen is when we go through, the board will be able to push in more as we are not taking off enough. So to set this up, just get it as close as you can. You can decide whether to use a scrap piece, which is what I normally do. I don't like to waste wood, so I usually just keep some scrap pieces around to get this set up. Another one of the limitations, obviously, is if you want to use a longer board and the fingerboard to hold it, you then become limited by the distance. If you're not using a fingerboard, you have this whole table and wider to work with. Now we're gonna do our test run here, and the easiest way is if your board is not super rough, or you can easily tell when you've got complete, just draw some pencil marks all the way down the side. We're just gonna make a first pass where we think it's right, and we'll be able to tell pretty quickly whether or not it is set up right. All right, so there's our result. Very clean, very nice. Amazingly, the first setup was right. That almost never happens. And this is, as you can see, nice and straight and jointed and flat, and that is exactly what we're looking for. All right, we're now gonna run through the larger board with a much rougher edge, and it will take multiple passes almost certainly because I'm not taking a huge cut. I am gonna set up some fingerboards to help hold this for me. This is about on the limit of what I would like to do on this by myself. Obviously, one of the keys with a jointer is the pressure, where you place it along the way, and so is the case here with the router table. You need pressure going in here, and then as you transition over to here, you need pressure on the outfeed side. So with a really long piece, it can be a little tricky without some help holding it. Now, as with any type of edge jointing, the flatness of your face throughout the entire board is going to play a big role. If this is not flat and it's twisted, cupped, warped, whatever, it will not maintain 90 degrees to the fence. You'll get a straight edge and it will be nice and clean, but it will not be consistently 90 degrees. So as with any jointing method, it's going to produce the best results with flattest faces you can get. All right, let's run this through and see how it goes. Now, this is after our first pass. You can see we've started to remove some of the high areas, but we're gonna need to take at least another pass, if not 2, to deal with all of this down here. I'm not worried about this chip out area here. I'm not gonna bother removing that far for now, but we still have a little ways to go. And there we have it, a nice, clean, flat, straight edge on what was initially a very rough board. So a lot of setup time relative to other methods. Great result. This is so clean, like I said, you could glue straight up from this. That'll depend a little bit on how sharp your router bit is and your technique. You can also see that we have essentially no dust. There's a little here, a little there, but we've removed a fair bit. Remember, if you're doing this with feather boards, you have to move them in after each pass as you've taken off some material. All right, let's move on to the next technique. The third method we're going to cover is the freehand router method. You can use a fixed base or a plunge base for this. You're going to need either a templating bit, pattern bit, whatever you want to call it. It needs to have a bearing and a straight edge on it. You're going to need some material that has a known straight edge. I prefer to use something wooden in case I set the depth of this wrong and run into it. You could use a metal or plastic straight edge if you want. You're going to need something to hold your workpiece down, whether it's hot glue, double stick tape. And the upsides of this are, as long as your straight edge is long enough, you could, joint a 40-foot board. You're just running your router essentially with this board hanging over the edge. If you're using a templating bit, if you're using a pattern bit with the bearing at the top, you will have to run this the other way around with the board on the bottom. Now, the other two main upsides of this are that it's mobile. You could take your router anywhere that you have a power source, and you can take your straight edge anywhere you want. Now, the downsides are that you will need to store a long straight piece if you want to do really long boards, so that's going to be something you just have to keep around. It's not as good for narrower pieces, as if you're using this templating bit, you are running your router across the top. If you've got a very narrow piece, that's going to be hard. You could do it the other way around with a templating bit and hang this off the side. May get a little sketchy, but the wider the piece, the better for this to fit your router base onto. One of the downsides as well is that this is going to put dust everywhere. There is no good dust collection unless your router has some sort of built-in dust collection. It's going to fly. You need glue, double stick tape, something like that. Consumables. I always hate having to use consumables for things, but it is what it is. You need to affix this very well. And all we're simply doing is going to hang this edge slightly over this so that our bearing runs along this known straight edge, and we'll perfectly flush trim it to that straight edge. Once you have your board affixed, you only need the cutter head of your router to be hanging slightly over the workpiece that you're trying to joint. We just need the bearing to be riding up against our straight edge, so you don't need it any further than that. Now, one thing I would suggest is that if you've got this hanging out quite a bit, there's no need to take this all in one pass. You can start with your router without the bearing running up against here and just take some off as you go. And then as you get closer, your final pass will run the bearing along the straight edge. It can be a lot of work on a router to try to take a large cut at once. It can make it a little unwieldy. So just run it up against, just freehanding it essentially to remove some of the material before you go for the full final pass if you've got quite a bit taken out. All right, and once we're done, we've got a beautiful, clean, straight edge on that. As long as this is straight and your router bit is nice and sharp, you'll be glue ready to go right off of this. You can see how smooth that is, that the curl is ready to even come out there. You can also see just how absurdly dusty it gets, and like I said, this goes absolutely everywhere. So upsides and downsides. Well, thank you for watching this video. That's going to be all we covered today, our 3 methods of edge jointing. I hope you learned something new. If you have any questions, comments, concern, please leave them in the comment section, and hopefully you guys are having a good day. Thank you.